Can you hear the bell sound, children? How do you hear this? Do we use any specialized tissue for this? Specialized cells for this? Very good. So we use what type of receptors? Are phonoreceptors to receive the sound from the external environment. Wow, the flower is so beautiful. How do I say the flower is so beautiful? What type of receptor I use? Very good. Photoreceptors are used to detect vision. Very good. Mmm, it smells nice. So how do I smell and say it is nice? What receptor I use? I use my olfactory receptors to smell. Can you recollect, children? So what do we use for taste? Gustatory. Wow, it is so soft. So what receptor I use for touch? Thermo or tango receptors. So we know that we have certain specialized cells on the on the sense organs in order to detect the stimulus from the external environment. And these stimulus are sent to where? These stimulus are sent to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord it is sent to the brain, and from it is brain it is sent to the motor or muscles, and from muscles we respond. So I told you there is a stimulus and response mechanism with the help of spinal cord and brain. So which is carrying all the stimulus and response? The neurons or the nerves cells that plays a vital role. So I told you we have three types of neuron. The first is the sensory neuron. So which will receive the stimulus? The sensory neuron. So if I which is receiving? Very good. The sensory neuron that receives the stimulus and send it to the spinal cord. And what is the second neuron we have? We have the interneurons which act as the signal transmitting between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. And the third neuron is the motor neuron which will get the signal from the spinal cord and send it to the muscles, and from muscle we respond, right? So we have three types: sensory neuron, interneuron and motor neuron that plays a major role in giving the stimulus and response. And we see two parts here. One is the spinal cord, the other is the brain. So there are certain actions that involve brain, and there are certain actions that involve only the spinal cord. So let us say if an action involves only the spinal cord, we call that as involuntary, and if it involves brain, we call that as voluntary. So I told you the stimulus will either reach the brain or, which means the stimulus will initially reach the spinal cord, then it reaches the brain. But some action doesn't reach the brain, it stops here. So if it is stopping here, that takes place immediately without knowing. So that kind of action we call it as involuntary. So those actions are called involuntary. Say for example, blinking eyes. So when a dust enters, what do? We immediately blink our eyes. So are we knowing that priorly? No. So it is happening without our conscious. So such kind of actions are involuntary action which does not involve brain, and the action is purely from the spinal cord. That is why it is very spontaneous. Not only blinking eyes, even breathing, our heart beats, respiration. So all these things are involuntary action. And there are certain action that involves our brain. Say for example, walking, running, everything involves. So we plan and do. So that comes under voluntary. So voluntary action involves brain, whereas involuntary action involves spinal cord. It doesn't mean that brain is not involved. The spinal cord will do all the function in order to lower the burden of brain. And one more thing, the brain will know what is happening, but it doesn't show any interest towards it. Okay. And I told you we need to know two important concepts. One is the reflex arc, the other is the reflex action. So this reflex arc is an involuntary function, which means when something happens sudden. So if, say for example, I told you we sneeze immediately, we sneeze or cough. So that happens spontaneously without any plan. So that kind of involuntary action, that process we call it as the reflex action, and the pathway which is carried we call it as the reflex arc. Your mother is preparing dosa and you're entering into the kitchen and unknowingly you're touching the hot tawa. So what will happen? Will you touch it for a long time? Wow, it's nice. So let me touch it for a long time. Will you have that intention? No. So what do? We immediately withdraw our hands. So that withdrawing immediately is the action of spinal cord. So it is an involuntary action that is taking place in our body. But when you go see that hot plate for the second time, will you touch? No. Why? Because your brain will gather information saying it will be hot, it is not important to touch, so better stay away. So you will have such comments from your brain. So that the brain is not involved in sending signals, but still it can store up all the information. So when we touch any hot object, we receive the stimulus. So that receiving stimulus is by the receptors. So first the receptors will receive the stimulus. So then the receptor will send it to where? It sends to the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, so this stimulus is sent to the spinal cord by the sensory neuron. Okay. Now from the spinal cord, the signals reaches the muscles. And here finally we respond. That is, so here that the stimulus and here we response. Okay. This is effector, how we respond. And here we have certain nerves in the spinal cord which acts between the receptor and the muscle. So those nerves are the relay neuron or the interneurons. So relay neurons are neurons that are present in the spinal cord that acts as an intermediate between the receptors and the muscle. Then from the spinal cord, which will carry, there is another neuron called the motor neuron. So this motor neuron will carry to the muscle, and from the muscle we respond. So that is effector. So this is receptors, effector, and this is effector. This is how the signal transmits immediately, which is involuntary. Here, the brain will know all the function. The brain will watch everything, but it doesn't involve. So it is purely the spinal cord involving in this action. So the pathway from the hot object to the response, the pathway you call it as reflex arc. So how it is carried out? So that pathway you call it as reflex arc, and the total process you call it as reflex action. So you call the total process as reflex action. So not only touching a hot object, sometimes sneezing, even a torchlight, when a torchlight or a dust enters your eyes, we immediately blink or try to close. So all these are few examples of reflex arc and the reflex action. Any doubts, children?